Jamie Parker stared out the frosted windowpane at the yard below, his breath fogging the glass. The snow lay untouched, save for a single set of footprints trailing toward the oak tree at the edge of the yard, and something was missing. The snowman. For as long as Jamie could remember, there had always been a snowman standing proudly in that spot, a tradition he shared with Grandpa Ed every Christmas. But not this year. This year, the yard felt hollow, just like everything else since Grandpa Ed had passed away. His mother's voice broke the silence. "You should go out and build it," she said softly, appearing behind him. "Grandpa would have wanted you to." Jamie's gaze lingered on the yard, on the spot where the snowman should have been. He wasn't sure he could, not without Grandpa Ed. But as his mom turned away, Jamie noticed something strange, a glint of yellow against the snow at the tree's base. His heart thudded. It wasn't there a moment ago. Jamie's throat tightened at the memory. He fiddled with the frayed end of his scarf, another relic of Grandpa Ed's, before sighing and grabbing his coat. "I'll be outside," he mumbled. The air hit him like a slap as he stepped out, the chill biting at his cheeks and the tip of his nose. The yard was quiet, except for the faint creak of bare branches in the wind. He looked around for a moment, taking in the stillness, before scooping up a handful of snow. Jamie hadn't realized how much he missed this, the satisfying crunch of snow between his fingers, the way it felt to roll the first ball and see it grow bigger and bigger as it collected more of the icy fluff. He bent to his task with a focus he hadn't felt in weeks, shaping the snow into smooth, round mounds. Grandpa Ed's voice echoed in his mind as he worked. "Patience and heart, kid. That's the secret to a snowman that lasts." The base was done in under an hour, a sturdy dome that gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. Jamie added the middle section, and then the head, each piece fitting snugly atop the other. He stepped back to survey his work, brushing his gloved hands together. "Not bad," he said aloud, though his voice sounded small in the vastness of the yard. It was missing something. Jamie trudged to the garage, where Grandpa Ed's old gardening hat, the fedora he never went outside without, hung on a nail near the door. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing against the worn brim before grabbing it. Back at the snowman, he carefully placed it on the snowman's head, tilting it at a jaunty angle. Then he added the finishing touches: button eyes, a crooked carrot nose, and a wobbly stick mouth. The snowman wasn't perfect. Its shape was a little lopsided, and one of the buttons wouldn't stay in place, but it stood tall, a proud figure in the middle of the yard. Jamie smiled, feeling a flicker of warmth despite the cold. For the first time in months, he didn't feel so alone. But then something caught his eye. There, at the base of the snowman, was a small envelope, half buried in the snow. Jamie froze, his breath clouding in front of him. The envelope hadn't been there when he finished stacking the snow. He was sure of it. The paper was thick and yellowed, and his name Jamie was written in neat, looping cursive across the front. The handwriting tugged at something deep in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. It felt familiar yet, not entirely. Was it someone from his grandfather's life? A neighbor? Or someone else entirely? The thought sent a shiver down his spine as he opened the envelope. With a racing heart, Jamie knelt and picked it up, brushing off the snow. He hesitated, glancing around the yard. The trees at the edge of the property stood still, their bare branches stark against the gray sky. No one was there. Jamie's gloved fingers trembled as he tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, the edges slightly crinkled. Written in the same cursive handwriting was a short message. "Look behind the oak tree at the edge of the yard." His stomach flipped. Jamie turned toward the tree, its massive trunk and twisting roots a familiar sight in the fading light. He'd climbed that oak countless times with Grandpa Ed, back when his legs were still small enough to dangle freely from its branches. Now it loomed over the yard like a silent giant, its gnarled bark casting shadows in the snow. Jamie's eyes darted back to the snowman, its button eyes seeming to glint in the low light. He shivered. "It feels like it's watching me," he thought. With the note clutched tightly in one hand, Jamie trudged toward the oak tree. The snow crunched under his boots, each step amplifying the quiet around him. The base of the tree was covered in frost, but as Jamie knelt to inspect it, he noticed something unusual: the edge of a wooden box peeking out from beneath the roots. Jamie brushed away the snow with his hands, revealing more of the box. It was small and old, with brass hinges dulled by time. His fingers fumbled with the latch as anticipation bubbled inside him. When the lid finally gave way, Jamie gasped. Inside was a collection of objects he'd never seen before: a photograph of Grandpa Ed as a young man in a military uniform, a bundle of letters tied with twine, and a medal engraved with a star. Jamie stared, his chest tightening. What is this?" he whispered. Jamie sat cross-legged on the worn living room rug, the wooden box between his knees. His mother sat on the couch, leaning forward with the photograph of Grandpa Ed clutched tightly in her hands. Behind him, the snowman stood silently, its button eyes fixed on him. "I've never seen this picture before," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The young man in the photo barely looked like the grandfather Jamie had known. His face was smooth and serious, his military uniform crisp and formal. Jamie glanced at the photo, then back at the medal resting in the box. The bronze star gleamed faintly in the warm light of the Christmas tree. "What's this for?" he asked, his finger hovering over it. His mother hesitated, her brow furrowing. "It's a medal for bravery," she said softly. "Your grandfather. He must have done something incredible to earn it, but he never talked about it, not even to me." Jamie frowned, his gaze shifting to the letters tied with twine. Why wouldn't he tell us? Her eyes softened. "Your grandfather didn't like to dwell on the past. He always said Christmas was about looking forward, not back." She placed the photograph gently on the coffee table. "But this is part of who he was. Maybe he wanted you to find it now." Jamie ran his fingers along the edges of the box, his mind spinning. The discovery felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. Someone had left the note at the Snowman for him to find, leading him to this hidden piece of his grandfather's life. But who? And why now? He untied the bundle of letters carefully, as if afraid they might crumble in his hands. The paper was thin, and the handwriting Grandpa Ed's, unmistakably, was neat and precise. The letters were addressed to Ma and Pa, written during his time serving overseas in World War II. Jamie read the first one aloud, his voice steady but quiet. December 20th, 1944. "Dear Ma and Pa, I hope this letter finds you well. The days here are cold, and snow covers everything like a great white blanket. It reminds me of home, of building snowmen with Jamie's dad when we were boys." Jamie stopped, swallowing hard. He hadn't expected to see his father's name, his dad, who had passed away when Jamie was just a toddler. He glanced at his mom, who gave him an encouraging nod to keep going. Jamie lowered the letter. His voice had begun to waver. He was thinking about snowmen even then? "There's not much time to write. The war has been hard on all of us, but I keep thinking about home. It gives me strength to get through each day. I can't wait to see the snow in the yard again. It feels like a lifetime since I've seen it." His mother smiled faintly. "That's how your grandfather was. No matter what he was going through, he always found something to hold on to." The next few letters revealed pieces of a story Jamie hadn't known before. A young Ed Parker, barely older than Jamie's own cousins, stationed in Europe during one of the coldest winters on record. He wrote about his squad huddling together for warmth, about the snowstorms that turned the fields into a frozen wasteland, and about the people they met, frightened civilians caught in the chaos of war. But it was the last letter in the bundle that made Jamie's breath hitch. It was dated December 24th, 1944. "Dear Ma and Pa, I don't know if this letter will reach you. Tonight, we found a group of refugees trapped in an abandoned church just outside the forest. There were so many of them, women, children, families who had nowhere to go. The snowstorm is picking up, and the road is too dangerous for vehicles, but I can't leave them here. I've volunteered to lead them to safety. It's a long trek through the woods, but I have to try. If something happens, please know that I did this because it felt right, because I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Merry Christmas, and thank you for teaching me what it means to care for others. Love, Ed. Jamie's hand trembled as he set the letter down. He saved them? All of them? His mother reached for the medal again, her expression unreadable. He must have. This medal, it's for something extraordinary. And knowing your grandfather, he wouldn't have written that letter if he didn't mean every word. But he never told us, Jamie whispered. His mother smiled faintly. That was Grandpa Ed. He didn't need anyone to know. He just wanted to do what was right. Jamie sat back, the weight of the discovery pressing against his chest. Jamie remembered a summer afternoon when he'd fallen off his bike and scraped his knee. Grandpa Ed had knelt beside him, his voice steady and kind. Sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared, it just means getting back up. That same steadiness echoed in the letters Jamie had read. Grandpa Ed, the man who taught him how to carve a turkey and tie his shoes, had been a aeronaut just to their family, but to strangers in the most desperate of circumstances. And yet, he had never once mentioned it. Jamie's gaze drifted to the window where the snowman stood in the yard, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. The snowman felt different now, as though it wasn't just a tribute to Grandpa Ed, but a connection to something bigger, something Jamie couldn't quite put into words. Then another thought struck him. "Mom," he said slowly, "if Grandpa never told us about this, who left the letter? And why now?" His mother frowned, her fingers tightening around the photograph. "I don't know," she admitted. "But someone wanted you to find this, Jamie. Maybe it was one of his friends from the war." "But why leave the letter at the snowman?" Jamie pressed. His mother's face softened. "Because that's where Grandpa Ed would have left it. He always said the snowman was a marker, right? Maybe he wanted it to mark this moment too." Jamie nodded, though the mystery gnawed at him. The snowman had always been special, but now it felt like a messenger, delivering secrets that had waited decades to be uncovered. The next morning, Jamie stood in the yard, staring at the snowman. The sun had risen behind it, casting long shadows across the snow, but its button eyes and carrot nose looked unchanged. Still, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow alive, watching over him. Who had left the letter? The thought had circled in his head all night, keeping him awake long after the house had gone silent. His mother's theory that it was an old friend of Grandpa Ed made sense, but it didn't explain why they hadn't come to the door or why they'd buried the box so carefully, leaving only the snowman as a clue. Jamie's eyes followed the faint tracks that led away from the snowman and into the woods. He hadn't noticed them before, but now they seemed obvious, like a trail waiting to be followed. "Who are you?" Jamie whispered, his voice barely audible in the crisp air. He turned back toward the house. His mother had left early to pick up groceries, leaving him alone for the morning. If he was going to solve this, now was the time. Jamie tightened his scarf and stepped forward, following the trail into the trees. The snow crunched under his boots, the sound sharp in the otherwise still forest. The tracks were small, likely from someone wearing hiking boots, and they wove through the woods with purpose, as though leading somewhere specific. After about 10 minutes, Jamie came to a clearing he didn't recognize. In the middle stood a small, weathered shed, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. It looked like it had been there for decades, though Jamie was sure he'd never seen it before. He hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his heart thudding in his chest. The tracks ended at the shed's door. Jamie's gloved hand trembled as he reached for the rusty latch. It gave way with a soft creak, and the door swung inward, revealing a dim interior filled with dust and cobwebs. The air inside was musty, tinged with the faint scent of damp wood. At first glance, the shed seemed empty, but then Jamie's eyes landed on a small wooden chest in the corner. The chest was plain, with a brass lock that looked worn but functional. On top of it was another envelope, identical to the one Jamie had found at the snowman. His name was scrawled across it in the same careful handwriting. Jamie tore it open, his pulse quickening. Jamie, you've already seen the courage your grandfather carried in his heart. But there's more to his story than what you found in the box. He wanted you to know not just what he did, but why. Open the chest, and you'll find the key to understanding. The note wasn't signed, but Jamie didn't need a name to know who it came from. This was Grandpa Ed's handwriting. There was no doubt in his mind. His fingers fumbled at the lock, which clicked open more easily than he expected. Inside the chest were 3 items: a leather-bound journal, a folded map, and an old pocket watch. Jamie's hand went to the journal first. It was worn but well preserved, and the faint scent of leather rose as he opened it. On the inside cover, written in Grandpa Ed's neat script, was a single line: "For Jamie when the time is right." His chest tightened. He flipped through the pages, which were filled with entries written during the war. Most were short, detailing daily life weather reports, troop movements, and rations. But interspersed between them were stories of kindness: soldiers sharing their last scraps of bread, civilians offering shelter, moments of laughter that punctuated the terror of battle. One entry stood out, dated the day after Christmas in 1944. "We made it through the storm." Every last one of them. It wasn't easy, the cold bit at our faces, and the path was treacherous, but something kept me going. I kept thinking about Jamie's dad, about the snowmen we used to build together, and how they always stood tall no matter what. I promised myself I'd stand tall too, for them. Jamie's throat tightened as he read the words. The snowman had been more than a tradition for Grandpa Ed. It had been a symbol of hope, a reminder to keep going, even in the darkest moments. He set the journal aside and unfolded the map. It was hand-drawn, showing a section of the forest surrounding their property. A red X marked a spot near the edge of the woods, not far from the shed. Jamie's curiosity flared. What could be out there? The answer had to be in the forest. The woods grew denser as Jamie followed the map, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. The trees seemed to crowd in closer the farther he went, their bare branches intertwining like skeletal hands. But the red X wasn't far, and soon he reached a clearing he hadn't seen before. In the center was an old stone marker, weathered and covered in moss. Etched into its surface were words barely visible beneath the frost. Jamie knelt, brushing away the snow with his gloves. The engraving read, "In memory of those who stood tall." Jamie ran his fingers over the letters, his chest tightening. This wasn't just a marker, it was a silent promise to remember. He could picture his grandfather carving snowmen each winter, their sturdy forms braving storms, always standing tall. They weren't just decorations, they were guardians of stories like this, messages for those willing to listen. Grandpa Ed had kept his promise to remember, and now it was Jamie's turn. It was his way of ensuring no one forgot the courage it took to stand when it mattered most. He didn't know exactly who the marker was for, perhaps the people Grandpa Ed had saved, or maybe his comrades who didn't make it home, but the meaning was clear. This was why Grandpa Ed had built snowmen every Christmas. It wasn't just for fun or tradition. It was a tribute, a promise to remember. Jamie's breath caught. He ran his fingers over the letters, the cold stone biting at his skin. Tears blurred his vision as he thought of his grandfather trudging through the snowstorm that night. This wasn't just a marker, it was a promise to remember, carved in stone. He swallowed hard, imagining his grandfather walking through the snowstorm that night, leading others to safety. The marker wasn't just for those who stood tall, it was for Grandpa Ed, too. Jamie stood slowly, his eyes stinging with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. The snowman in the yard felt heavier now, imbued with a legacy he hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a connection, a bridge between generations, and a reminder of the strength his grandfather had passed down to him. As Jamie turned to head back to the house, the wind picked up, stirring the snow around him. For a moment, he thought he heard a voice, a low, familiar rumble. Jamie smiled through his tears, clutching the map and journal tightly to his chest. He had a story to finish, one that was bigger than himself. Patience and heart, kid. That's the secret. The snow was falling thickly as Jamie made his way back to the house, the journal and map tucked carefully into his coat. The wind had picked up, and the distant sky was a bruised gray, promising more snow through the night. But Jamie's thoughts weren't on the weather, they were on the stone marker, the words etched into it, and the man who had built snowmen as quiet sentinels to the past. Inside the house, his mother was setting the table for dinner, her movements slow and distracted. She glanced up when Jamie entered, brushing snow from his coat. "Where were you?" she asked, concern flickering in her eyes. Jamie hesitated. The truth felt too big to keep to himself. He held out the journal, his gloved hands trembling. "I found more, Mom, about Grandpa." Her brows knitted together as she took the journal and opened it. Jamie watched as her expression shifted from confusion to wonder, her fingers brushing over the handwriting like it was something fragile. "He wrote all of this?" Her gaze lingered on the journal before shifting to the window, where the snowmen stood sentinel in the yard. "Your grandfather used to say snowmen marked moments, Jamie," she said softly, her voice catching. "Maybe this letter is another one of those moments, a way of showing you what mattered to him most." Jamie nodded. "There's a marker in the woods, too. I think it's for the people he saved or maybe for the soldiers he served with. Either way, it's like the snowmen, a way to remember them." His mother's eyes filled with tears. She set the journal down carefully and pulled Jamie into a hug. "Your grandfather was an incredible man," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And he would be so proud of you for finding this." That evening, as the snow continued to fall, Jamie and his mother sat by the fire, poring over the journal. Each entry painted a vivid picture of Grandpa Ed's life during the war, the camaraderie, the hardships, and the quiet acts of courage that had defined him. The final pages were dedicated to the people he had saved on that fateful Christmas Eve in 1944. One entry stood out. Jamie's mother smiled faintly as she read it aloud. "That's Grandpa, all right, always finding a way to look forward. I told myself I'd remember their faces, not just their fear, but their hope, too. Hope is a powerful thing. It kept me moving when my legs wanted to give out. I think that's why I love building snowmen so much. They stand tall no matter what, a reminder that even in the coldest times, we can keep going." Jamie glanced out the window at the snowman standing proudly in the yard. "We have to tell everyone," he said suddenly. "The family, they need to know about this." His mother nodded. "You're right. It's too important to keep to ourselves." The next afternoon, Christmas Day, the Parker family gathered in the living room, the smell of pine and roasted turkey filling the air. Jamie stood in front of the fireplace, clutching the journal in one hand and the bronze star in the other. His cousins, aunts, and uncles quieted as he cleared his throat. "I found something yesterday," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Something Grandpa Ed wanted us to know." He recounted the story of the box, the letters, and the journal. He read aloud the Christmas Eve entry, his words weaving a picture of a young man risking everything to save others in the middle of a war. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. His uncle wiped his eyes and reached for Jamie's shoulder. "Your grandfather would be so proud," he said. His cousins nodded, their faces a mixture of sadness and awe. Together, they carried the weight of Ed's story, sharing it like a gift passed down through generations. "He built snowmen every year to remember," Jamie said, his voice soft. "It wasn't just about Christmas, it was about standing tall no matter what, and I think we should do the same." His uncle wiped his eyes and gave a solemn nod. "That sounds like Ed, always thinking about others." The family exchanged quiet glances, and one by one, they made their way to the yard. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a fresh layer of white over the ground. Together, they built a new snowman next to the one Jamie had made, each of them adding a personal touch buttons from Grandma's sewing kit, a scarf knitted by Jamie's cousin, a broomstick from the shed. When they finished, Jamie stood back and gazed at the two snowmen side by side in the fading light. They looked like sentinels, watching over the yard and the family who had gathered to honor them. "Thank you," Jamie whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment, he thought he felt a hand on his shoulder, warm and steady. He turned, but no one was there. Jamie looked back at the two snowmen standing side by side, their forms lit softly by the moonlight. They weren't just decorations, they were guardians. They stood for everything Grandpa Ed had taught him: kindness, strength, and the quiet courage to keep going. As long as the snowmen stood, so would his memory. Symbols of strength, hope, and the love his grandfather had passed on. A quiet promise filled his heart. This tradition would never fade. That night, Jamie lay awake in bed, his thoughts racing. The journal and the medal sat on his nightstand, reminders of the day's discoveries. But one question still lingered. Who had left the letter by the snowman? As if in answer, a faint knock sounded at his window. Jamie sat up, his heart pounding. He crossed the room and peered outside, but the yard was empty except for the snowmen, their shadows long in the moonlight. Then he saw a new envelope tucked at the base of the original snowman. Jamie grabbed his coat and boots, rushing outside despite the biting cold. The letter was addressed to him again, in the same handwriting. He opened it with trembling fingers. Dear Jamie, I hope you understand now what your grandfather wanted you to see. Courage isn't always loud, it's often quiet, found in the small acts that carry us through hard times. Keep building snowmen, and remember, they stand tall because of the heart behind them. An old friend. P.S. He always spoke of this tradition with pride, saying it reminded him of a Christmas Eve when hope shone brightest, even in the darkest times. I was there that night, Jamie. Your grandfather's bravery saved me and many others. We honored his memory every year, inspired by the courage he showed that night. It's why I knew you had to find this. It's why we never forgot him. Jamie clutched the letter to his chest, his eyes stinging with tears. He didn't know who the friend was, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. Grandpa Ed's legacy wasn't just about his bravery, it was about love, resilience, and the quiet strength that came from keeping traditions alive. As Jamie turned to head back inside, the wind stirred, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the woods. A man in a long coat and hat, watching silently. The figure was barely more than a silhouette, but something about the angle of its head or the outline of the hat, Grandpa Ed's gardening fedora, made Jamie freeze. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Jamie smiled, his heart full. The snowmen stood tall in the yard, their presence a reminder that some legacies never fade.